Welcome back to Just Keep Skating. So I just wanted to make a little video sharing with you guys some little tips about building a tiny mini ramp. Quarter pipe. This is quarter pipe. Should be pretty self-explanatory as to why. Okay, first off, let's get into some quick dimensions. So this is only 1.5 feet high, which is like 18 inches, which is like 450 millimeters to the metric folk. I did it. I figured it out. Okay, I'm sticking with imperial here, guys. I'm a trained carpenter in imperial measurements, so I'm gonna stick with that. This video is going downhill. All right, I built it to work with 4-foot sheet goods. So this piece of Masonite right here is 4 feet by 4 feet, and so the whole design was intended to work with something like that. Now you can build it a little taller, a little smaller, whatever suits your needs. As for the transition radius, that is 4 feet. So on a 1.5 feet high ramp, a 4-foot transition gives you a reasonably tight transition. Enough that when you're doing your tricks and coming back in, you actually come back in with a little bit of speed. So some of the more difficult tricks still work well. Something like a frontside rock is gonna work way better with a slightly tighter transition than a slightly mellower one, because you ride back in faster and it helps you complete the trick with less resistance. So I like a tighter radius, but let's just say if you're building a 2-foot tall ramp, a 5-foot radius will be really nice. 6 foot will be a pancake. That'll be pretty mellow. Now, when I drew this radius, I just attached a pencil to a string and put it at the top of the sheet of plywood, which is 4 feet, and I just drew it out. The best way to find out what the best transition for you is to draw it out, take a look at it, and see if that looks like a nice quarter pipe to you. There's very few times where I've actually gotten the radius right on the first draw. Usually I look at it and I go, that's too mellow, that's too steep. But at the end of the day, you just gotta pick what looks right, get the jigsaw out, cut it out, and it's gonna be what it's gonna be. You'll just have to learn how to skate it. All right, let's flip this up and get a look at it. As for 2x4s, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you'll need about 4 8-foot 2x4s, cut them in half. And because you're going between 2 layers of plywood, which should be 3/4 inch, these edges need to be 3/4 inch plywood. You're gonna cut your 2x4s at 46.5, because 2 layers of 3/4 added up equals 1.5 inches. Take that off of 48, you got 46.5. Pretty simple math there. Now I also have a couple of 1x4s in here. I'll bring you up closer so you can see where those went. Okay, so in the back here, under where the coping goes, I added a 1x4 because I find there's often not enough meat to screw the plywood into. So I like to have an extra piece there just to help give you something else to screw to. And down here at the bottom, you can see I added another 1x4. So the 1x4 and the last 2x4 that I used, I put in on the flat, and that's just to give you more stuff to screw that 3/8 plywood into. So the first 2x4 I always put in is this one. It's the easiest one, and then it supports the whole thing so that you can put the other ones in. I then usually do this back one and this one right here. So the spacing for your 2x4s along the transition should be every 8 inches. In order to get that, you're gonna need to hook onto the edge of your transition. I'm gonna have to hook right here just for example, but you can't just go like this. Okay, there's a lot of air right here and right here in your tape measure. You actually need to find a way to squish your tape measure down, or you're not going to get an accurate every 8 inches measurement. It'll be off by at least 1/4 inch. So once you get your 2x4s screwed into place, the next thing to do is to get a measurement for your plywood. Now, because this is a quarter pipe, not a half pipe, you gotta figure out somewhere for your plywood to end. So what I always do is I look at where is the plywood naturally going to end off of the transition. So when measuring that, I would pick a few inches past the transition. In this case, it was about 3 inches, 2.5, 3 inches past where the plywood transition part ends. And then the next piece of plywood was again, another 2 inches longer. Quick little editor's note here. I didn't even talk about the plywood in this video, so I have to go back into the garage while I'm in my sweatpants and slippers. All right, first off, the plywood has to be 3/8. 3/8 is a really nice, easy plywood to bend, but it's not so thin that you're gonna have a ramp that isn't sturdy. And the second thing is I usually like to start from the top and work my way down. So I'll put the first piece of plywood lining up with my notch for the coping. I then often like to install the coping before moving on to the second layer of plywood. But one thing I want to note about installing the plywood is make sure you start from the top, and I often start in the middle of the sheet and I work my way out like that. And then I do each stud consecutively down, and make sure that all of your screws are going into the studs that you've installed. If your second layer isn't also going into the studs, it's not going to get sucked up tight. And then the other part I need to mention is careful where you have your weight on the sheet. If you're standing on the sheet while trying to screw it in, you might wind up with your plywood not getting sucked tight to the studs. So once I have that first row in the top in, I'm always kind of trying to kick my plywood in so that it's got pressure that wants to suck it down tight to the studs. Super important to get that sucked down tight to the studs. Anyways, at the risk of this video being a little disjointed, we're now going to get back to what I said the other day. Now, figuring out the notch for your coping is obviously going to depend on the size of your coping. I had tiny coping. I think it can't be more than 1 3/4. Yeah, it's only 1.5 inches. So my notch is like a 1/2 inch by 1 inch. It's super tiny. What I can say though is it's really easy to either overcut or undercut. And I can't tell you exactly which one you're gonna do. I always have a tendency to undercut it and my coping sticks out too much. So on this project, I actually measured in a little more than my last 2 projects where the coping stuck out too much. And the other thing I can tell you is that if you do cut it in a bit too much, it's easier to put a shim under the coping after it's done than it is to have to cut out more of the plywood and material. So to give you guys an idea, anything between 1/8 and 1/4 inch is a decent lip. 1/4 inch starts to get a little bit aggressive. I love it, but for some people 1/4 inch is a lot. And anything under 1/8 is noping. So there's no coping there for you to grab on. And having some coping there is really important. You don't just want a piece of metal that's hanging out under the surface of your ramp. There's 2 reasons for this. One, you need coping, right? Let's say you're doing a 5/0 or something. Obviously you can't on this short little ramp, but the point is, if this coping doesn't stick up, there's nothing for your wheel to grab. You'll just fall into the ramp. So you gotta have a little bit of coping sticking out. It's gonna help. And then the other reason you need to have a little bit of coping sticking out right here is for like fakey pop tricks. If you don't have any coping, then you're just gonna roll onto it without actually getting that nice satisfying pop. So in order to get the coping on, you're gonna need 2 metal drill bits. So it's just high-speed metal drill bits. They're pretty standard. You're gonna need one that's bigger than the head of the screw, and then you're gonna need one that's a little bit bigger than the shank of the screw. That way the head of the screw fits in here, and it makes it pretty easy to get a drill bit in there after. And for attaching the coping, 1.5 inch screw should be fine. Hopefully you've got plenty of meat where you decided to position the coping. One thing I should definitely note is how big the deck should be on a 1/4 pipe or mini ramp. So you need at least about what I've given it here. So I'm measuring from the tip of the coping, so outside edge of the coping, you need at least about 17 inches, and I'll show you why. The last thing you want is to be doing like a fully decked rock and roll and have your wheels go over the edge. So having 17 from the edge of the coping will make about any board up to a 15-inch wheelbase work. Once you start getting wider wheelbases than 15 inches, really, I mean, 24 inches is a nice comfy space, right? 2 feet. You make a 2-foot deck and that'll work good. So don't forget to account for that when cutting out your transitions. And then maybe you won't have to have this silly little thing coming off the very end of your ramp, but it doesn't bother me. Oh, and one other thing to note is if it's up against a wall, you actually need at least 24 inches because you're gonna have to have the room for the nose too. So 17 inches if it's not against the wall, 24 if it's going right up against the wall. That's bare minimum. And next we get on to the Masonite. So this is where I get it from. It's just called 1/4 inch hardboard. I like 1/4 inch way more than 1/8. I find 1/8 is really unforgiving. There's not enough meat there to sink the screw heads properly without just blowing through it. It's super important to countersink your hardboard or 1/4 inch material, whatever it is you use. Because if you don't countersink it, your screw heads are gonna stick up too much or just tear the material and go right through it. Like, super important to countersink. And it doesn't take that long on something this small. But no matter what size your ramp is, it's absolutely essential. So let's really quickly again look at the overlap of the materials and how it goes to the floor. So there's our plywood transition. You can see there's the screws from where the 1x4 was. So we have something to bite into right here. You're gonna need to use really short screws, because if you use long screws, it's gonna lift it up off the floor. The only reason it's lifted off the floor is because I have it on my rubber mats right now. But as we can see, I tried to make sure that every single layer ends up going to the floor. You can see we got a few layers there. And surprisingly, this 1/4 inch hardboard is actually holding up and hasn't cracked yet. I've actually been planning on putting sheet metal there, but just haven't gotten around to it. So normally what you would actually do is you would actually cut this off and then put some, you know, maybe 8 inch, maybe 6 inch, whatever you can find by 1/8 or 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch will be too thick. It's probably 1/8 sheet metal. I'm not really sure. I haven't had to go buy it yet, but generally you'd cut that off and then you'd install the sheet metal right there so you have a really strong transition onto your transition. But because this is holding up so well, I haven't even done it. As for screw spacing, I made my screw spacing a little bit too tight on this. You can get away with, like, say every 8 inches going down and every 1 foot going out. I mean, you might even be able to get away with 1 foot by 1 foot. There's definitely a few too many screws on this. But for such a small project, an 8x8 screw pattern was fine. For a large ramp, an 8x8 screw pattern would be ridiculous. I'm telling you guys, I actually don't like building mini ramps. I love skating mini ramps, but I don't like building mini ramps because when you're done putting in the screws after, you know, like, it's thousands and thousands of screws, your back will be aching. Like, I never want to put another screw in a mini ramp ever again. But in order to get to skate one, you just got to do it. Anyways, the fact that I'm kind of rambling on about that and that we've finally gotten to the Masonite means that the ramp's built and it's time to have the montage. Well, hope you enjoyed that, and that was building a small quarter pipe. So one thing I didn't mention is if it's going outside, make sure you use treated lumber and skatelite. And if it's going to be inside like this one is, then you can use all just regular lumber. However, all that being said, my garage is starting to get really crowded, especially ever since I built this little home gym and added the floor in here. I don't even have the space for this in here anymore. So I'm actually going to swap out the Masonite with a piece of skatelite, and I'm going to put it outside. The regular lumber is going to last about 2 years maybe before it starts to get a little bit crusty. And that'll be good enough. That's all we need. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Hopefully that's been a useful video that you got something out of. And I want to say, as always, thanks for watching Just Keep Skating. Lots more videos coming. Till the next one, you guys.